All right. Well, we started the introduction to wisdom literature as a unit last week. Give you an overview of that, and that means that we are focusing rather particularly on 5 books in the Old Testament that fit this what they call this genre, this category, and yet at the same time. We know that wisdom is not limited to those books alone. We find wisdom throughout the whole of Scripture. And having done that, we want to delve into the book of Proverbs first. I didn't mention last time, we're going to take it in this order. I'm going to talk about Proverbs first, and then the Psalms, and then the book of, I think it's Ecclesiastes. No, Job is next. And then Ecclesiastes, and after that, the Song of Solomon. Because I think that is, going through those books in that order, that's really an increasing challenge of our awareness and our understanding and of our appreciation for those books. And so building on the earlier books and carrying that into the later ones, I think will make a big difference to us. Introducing you to the book of Proverbs, let me just start by reading the first 7 verses of the book. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. This is the summation of the entire book, of course. In 7 verses. You might even say that it's a summation of the entire book in 1 verse, because this is, everything else that's going to be taught has to do with a man's relationship to God first, and then his relationship to his world. That's fundamental to keep in mind throughout all of our studies here. Last week I observed that the wisdom literature is not really a part of the flow of redemptive history. There's no promise of the Messiah that really stands out as a theme in these books. It's more the day-to-day thing that is of the mindset that doesn't change. Things don't change. Certain things don't change in experience. And therefore, wisdom is something you need to gain no matter what age you live in. And it is something you need to teach your children, because when they grow up, it will be pertinent in their adult lives, and they will then teach their children. So there is a cyclical nature to biblical wisdom. And that, of course, the foundation for that, the grounding foundation for that cyclical wisdom is the foundation of creation itself and of God making this world a moral universe. There is a right and a wrong that is built in and established to all of creation, and that does not ever change. And we talked about how, that we don't appeal, therefore, to a Supreme Court to tell us what's right and what's wrong at any particular given time in United States history. We don't take a vote who wants to say this is right, all in favor. We realize that in essence, the bottom line is that right and wrong are things that come illustrated for us, portrayed for us in the 10 Commandments, and are fundamental to all of life, all of creation. That does not change. And of course, the ultimate proof of that is the fact that we all face the judgment of God after we live this life and we stand before the throne of God in glory. We are judged. Of course, first in grace we're received. That's the promise of redemption. but we are considered wicked or not regarding our response to the moral instruction of God and His Word. Now, what we're going to talk about today is the authorship of Proverbs. We're going to talk about who wrote it and what we know about that author. There are 3 times in the book of Proverbs that authorship is cited as being Solomon. It's in the very beginning, for chapter 1, verse 1. Then it's even introduced formally in chapter 10. And then it's also mentioned toward the end of the book in Proverbs 25. And that covers the extent of the book, except for 2 places toward the end. There are 2 chapters that are added to the end. Chapter 30, it says the words of Agur, son of Jacob, or Yake, and unfortunately we don't know who that is. There's some speculation, there's some guesswork, but we just fundamentally don't know. The other is chapter 31, which are the words of King Lemuel. Now we don't know who that is either. Some people speculate, well, maybe that's his Solomon's mother's nickname for Solomon. Cutie pie, Lemuel, whatever. But we don't know that for sure either. That's just grasping at straws. There really is no historical record of who these 2 are, but they are added to this. Of course, you remember chapter 31, the very memorable last half of that chapter is the wise woman, and how that is well known by us. But I have also called attention to the fact that the first half of chapter 31 speaks to the son and speaks soberly about how he is to live his life. And that is always just as important, to bring out both sides of that coin. Now, with regard to that authorship question, I don't want to use the word higher critical, but it really started with that. The idea, the turn of the 20th century showed a lot of opening up of speculation and theology according to doubt, if I can use that term, saying, well, we're not going to trust the Bible for what it says. We're going to look for ways in which it's not what it says. And starting in the 20th century, there was a rise in higher critical thinking, to use a term, that basically dismissed the idea that Solomon actually wrote the book of Proverbs. The idea is that skeptics always want to push dates of authorship farther ahead. They want to push it down the road so that they can say, see, this was written many, many years, maybe in centuries after the supposed accounts. And in doing that, they want to cast a shadow of doubt on the reality of what they're writing about. The conclusion of that is that it's very probable that King Solomon never wrote any Proverbs. It was probably some priest later down the line. And he may not have even existed in the first place. I mean, doubt just continues to mount and build upon itself. And one of the things they always call a question about is these lines in chapter 25. These are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. And they say, aha, see, it's Hezekiah. Well, Hezekiah was much later, and isn't that proof of what we just claimed? But that isn't what's being claimed there. The words of Solomon are being collected. And when you read Proverbs, and you know that it is a series of Proverbs that in many cases, in many of the chapters, are just verses that are unconnected, really, then you realize there is some editing that is going on. But this is not redaction. This is not correction or original writing given credit to somebody who lived a long time ago, who they want you to think really was something which is historically not true. So that really doesn't prove anything. So we're going to go with the traditional claim and with the claim of the Bible itself that Solomon wrote these. And therefore it's important for us to ask the question, why Solomon? why did God choose Solomon to write words of wisdom? Who was Solomon, and why should we listen to him? All right, now that means that we have to go back into the historical record of Solomon's life. And to do that, we go into Samuel and Kings. And in order to really understand Solomon, we have to understand him in context, which means we have to go back to his father David. And if we understand David, we have to go back to Saul. And it's important, therefore, to start with Saul. But as we do that, I want you to understand the one theme that we're going to see throughout all of these men. When you read the stories of their lives in Samuel and Kings, you're not reading biographies. You're not reading just straightforward, he was born on this date, and this is when he did this, and this has happened, and this is when he died. But there is a purpose sown into the entire flow of Samuel and Kings. What would that purpose be? Anybody want to guess? No. Good guess, but not the case. Not their faith. Remember, we're in Proverbs. Why would we want to ask? What?
Consequences of their choices.
Moral issues in their lives and how they lived, making those moral issues, and how they failed. And the consequences or the benefits of their choices. That's what you find when you go back and you read. This is what is being illustrated. Now, let me point this out in another way. If you were to go back and read the annals of the kings of Babylon, for instance. Oh. Somebody, I guess, who has. Or as is recorded in the book of Esther, the king of Persia, the diary of the king of Persia, you would find stories of his reign, of his battles, of his legislation, that all had one theme to them. They all made the king look good. My Old Testament professor used to have a great, I can't remember the specifics of this, maybe you can, Kurt, but used to have a great illustration about one time. He said the king led his army into battle, and he laid siege to this, and he destroyed many of their people, and it was just an overage of boasting of the battles. And then my professor paused and said, "That's the one he lost." And that's the theme of their history is, to glorify the king. But the theme that we have in Samuel and Kings of these kings is not lifting them up and glorifying them. It's teaching us that we live in a moral world, that they make choices that sometimes are good, sometimes are bad. There are benefits to the good choices, there are consequences to the bad ones. And sure enough, that's what we find. When you realize that, that is what you see throughout the whole of this historical account. Solomon's father was David, and David, of course, we know grew up a man of great faith. He wrote Psalm 23 based on his shepherding experience. The times when he stood acting on his conscience are demonstrated there, and that's important. But David grew up under the service and the reign of King Saul. Saul was the very first one to be king over Israel. Now, what do you remember about Saul? He was tall and good looking. That's kind of like some people, He was tall and good looking, and that meant that he was the epitome of the king. You remember how he became king? When the people came to Samuel and said, "We want a human king like all the other nations." Well, that's a moral choice. We're going to reject God. We don't want God as our king anymore. We want a human king. So right away, there are moral issues involved. And Saul was raised up by the people because he looked the part. He was manly, he was a leader, he was a soldier, he He was everything outside that you could possibly think a king should look like, and they loved him. And things started off very well. He was under the tutelage of Samuel the prophet. Now, Samuel is a bridge kind of character. He's the last of the so-called judges. Remember the book of Judges. Judges called for moral accountability to the people. There's that morality again coming back. But he also led into the history of the monarchy. And so Samuel was the one who was the mentor for Saul. And as long as Samuel kept Saul straight, things went very well for Saul. He continually discipled Saul, and Saul received his advice and counsel. But in 1 Samuel chapter 13, Saul makes a foolish mistake. Anybody remember what that is? He performs a priestly act. He shows a lack of respect for what? For the worship of God, for pragmatic reasons. I didn't want him to get away. We had to hurry up with this offering so I could go ahead and attack. And it was called on him, not because it was a smart decision as a soldier, but because he despised God in his heart, and he decided to go ahead and do what he wanted to do anyway. And that continues to another episode, which was based on greed. He wanted to keep animals that he should have slaughtered. He was instructed to slaughter. He wanted to keep for himself. And that, in effect, was the last straw. He was judged by God in that. And the end of his reign was pronounced. So Saul is regarded, what goes down in history, not as being a good and effective king because he kept the borders and because he fought his Philistines and because it's all the other things, but because he defied God. It was a moral judgment. Now, David is then prophesied as the next king of Israel. 1 Samuel 16, he's anointed, as a child and brought in off the field. He's anointed as a child. And we read about David as he's growing up, his confrontation with Goliath. He performs his music to soothe Saul's fevered brow. His popularity continues to grow to the point where he begins to be a problem for Saul. Saul now is jealous of David. But he gives him his daughter. Maybe marriage will preoccupy him. Saul gives him Michal, his daughter, for marriage, and so David now has a wife. Saul becomes possessed with David's jealousy, begins to pursue David, and that is when his mentor dies. His mentor is taken away from it. That's also, I think, part of the judgment of God going on here. And then at that point, there is this incident in David's life with Nabal and Abigail. And you wonder, where in the world did this come from? What is this supposed to prove? What is this supposed to demonstrate? Why is this story in here? You say, well, it's a nice story. It answers a question about Abigail. But the point is that it's not about David. It's about wisdom and foolishness. In fact, the incident, they come across Nabal and Abigail, and Nabal is even conveniently named. It means fool. The man's name is Fool. Duh. Do you get the point? It couldn't be more clear to the reader what's going on. Abigail is described in contrast to her husband. She's beautiful. Okay, that's fine. That's great. We're glad to hear that. But what else? She's discerning. She is wise. So the story of David with Nabal and Abigail has to do with wisdom and the moral nature of creation as well. Nabal is a fool. He is harsh and badly behaved, and there's demonstrations of that. David is about to trounce him and wipe him off the map, and Abigail comes to his rescue and intercedes for her husband. Intercedes for her husband. You would think, Abigail, just get rid of him. Let David, why bother? She's a good wife. She intercedes for her husband. But Nabal, nonetheless, dies in the judgment of God at just the right time, by the way. And what does David do? He takes Abigail as his wife. Is that according to the moral law? No. Even then, you don't buy the business that people tell you, bigamy was okay back then and all this. It was never okay. It was never okay. David has made a foolish choice. And because he's made this foolish choice, there's going to be compounding consequences that build in his life going forward. He makes a foolish choice with Abigail. He also takes another woman, clear out of the blue, no story about her, no background about her. We don't need to know anything about her, just that David decides to marry her too. And so now he's got 3 wives. David is anointed king, 2 Samuel 2 and 5. There's 2 chapters to that because David's reputation is already questionable to the point where, I forget which is first. I think it's Israel first. Judah. Judah's first, right? The lower tribes of Judah, I think, get me wrong on this, accept him as king first, and then later the other ones reluctantly take him on. And it has to do with questions they have about him and about his character. David is victorious. He continues to defeat all his enemies. He is blessed of God in that regard, and he continues to push the boundaries of Israel back. The borders of Israel are now no larger than they've ever been before and will ever be again. The kingdom of Israel is now greater and at more peace than it will ever know. David has succeeded to win all of these battles and to defeat all of his enemies. And so it's at that point that he takes Jerusalem and he says, this is going to be my capital. And he brings the ark into Jerusalem with great celebration before the Lord. And it's at that point, well, no, it's not that point. He sets up his own house in Jerusalem, and everything comes to what you would regard as a climactic venture. David is on top of the world. He's at peace. Everything is fine. And then comes the next episode in his life. Babylonian kings would never write something like this in their histories. Why is it even in here? They would say, David has every right. He's king. He can do whatever he wants. He can take whoever's wife he wants and put whoever death he wants. Why is this in here? David's at the top of his, this is, who are you to question David? And yet that's exactly what we have, is we have the full-length account of David with Bathsheba in all of its gory detail, written out as if David was not in control of what was being written. And so not only, are the basics mentioned, the explicit nature of the sins, plural, are listed for us. Why? Not because, just because we're talking about a moral nature of David's reign and the consequences that come from it. So the development continues. First, he gives himself to idleness. He decides, I don't need to lead the army anymore. They're just doing police work. It's no big deal. And so he hangs around the palace. He gets himself into sexual trouble with Bathsheba. One of the issues about pornography is that it moves the heart of the man to want to possess what he looks at. That's the devious nature of it. He looks at a woman lustfully. He wants to possess her, which means use her as a thing. And that is age-old. And that is also an immoral act. Those things never change. It's continually the same. So he lusts after her, he wants her, and he takes her, and then to ensure that he as king is able to have her, he makes sure that her husband is killed off. So now he's guilty of murder. And again, this is the king, but God says this is immoral. You have broken the commandment. God will judge him. He eliminates the husband so that he can have her, and he marries her too. David is then confronted by the prophet Nathan. You know how this story goes. He tells the parable that he knows David will have a sense of justice about, and says, the man who did this must die. And then Nathan, with those classic words, you are the man to convict him. If you were the king, if you were used to getting everything your way, nobody's going to tell you what to do, what would you do if you were David? What would you do?
Execute Nathan.
Yeah. We don't need Nathan anymore. Saul's problem was he listened to Samuel too much. Samuel was a nag. Now Nathan's being a nag. Nathan, you need to disappear. I'm the king. I get to do whatever I want, which is a sin in itself, right? The idea that I am above, we talk about being above the law. It's above the morality of all the earth. That's what the sin is. I don't have to obey God. I am the king. I do what I want. Now, why didn't David respond that way? Only the Holy Spirit intervening in his life would have changed his heart. Think about what he's done. He's justified to himself everything he's done in regards to Bathsheba's incident. And now he hides it to his own satisfaction. There is nothing in his heart that is going to change his mind. He must be convicted by the Holy Spirit, not just Nathan, but by the Holy Spirit. And so he is driven by the Holy Spirit to repentance and to return to wisdom. It's wisdom that humiliates him, makes him humble himself before God and before others. He humbly submits helplessly as he watches his son die. Remember, he mourns and he prays and he waits for God's hand upon Bathsheba's delivery until the son dies. And this is a remarkable point in his life. He stands up at the death of the son. He stands up and he realizes that God's judgment has been pronounced. The consequences of his own sin have been carried out. And he utters that phrase, that clause in 2 Samuel 12:23 that is so amazing, so profound, that a glimpse of the promise of the resurrection hope that was also there in those days. I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. And then he writes Psalm 51. We'll talk about Psalm 51 later in the course, but Psalm 51, of course, is that classic psalm that's written of David searching his heart and realizing the depth of his sin and how he is not someone who should be looked up to in a sense of perfection or in a sense of great authority. Is it enough? Whenever you read Psalm 51 in the context, you think, is this enough? We're not sure. How would we take it? I know. One lady in my former church, said, I can't buy this. And I don't blame her. Because this is a severe sin. And just to say, I'm sorry, doesn't seem to cut it. But David's life from that point receives consequences that are out of his control and spins off in a direction that ruins everything that he's ever gained. Starting with the fact that he keeps Bathsheba as his wife. He doesn't repent enough to say, my marriage to you is really inappropriate, and separate himself from her. He keeps her as his wife. They have another child, and that's Solomon. That's the context in which Solomon is born. But he goes on, and his reputation, as you read on in Samuel Kings, his reputation is ruined. His family and his kingdom begin to degrade. His sons rise up and despise him. There is great politics and intrigue in his own household. His kingdom is damaged. There's a relative of Saul that shows up out of nowhere and disappears, named Shimei, who prophetically speaks to David, and he says, "See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood." And his soldiers say, "Let me lop his head off, King David." And David says, "No, let him go," because he's receiving the rebuke from God with those words. His sons despise him, and they seek, one after another, they plot to throw him over. Instead of trying to let the kingdom fall to the son of David's choice, or the oldest son in the primogenitor, they fight with each other, and there are schemes. Those schemes are laid out in the story, which is embarrassing to David's history and the story of his life. There's acts of immorality that are done, severe acts of immorality that are done, parading immorality before the people in order to shame David and to bring him down and to curse his name and to lift up their own. And so that they've given in to the idea that immorality is a way to win. But ultimately, his wars with his enemies return. Consequence. His enemies begin to push on the borders again. Consequence. He doesn't have the peace that he once had. David is now threatened. What does David do? He returns to his army. And he returns to leading his army to push back these enemies. But now, maybe it's because he's older, maybe because he's fearful, maybe because he's not sure of himself anymore, maybe because he's not sure of his relationship to God anymore. He decides he has to be sure of his military, and so he calls for account. I have to know who I have. I've got to know where my strength is. So he calls for a census, which God prohibited him from doing. Now that's not across the board. That's not a moral issue for all time and for all people, but it was for David. He was told specifically, do not break this commandment of God. Trust in me, do not count your men, as if that was going to help. But David did it. He had a census, and God, through the prophet, said, this is going to bring judgment upon you. In fact, God gave him 3 choices as to how he was going to be disciplined for this. David was not capable of making that decision. He was not willing to take that decision on himself. And so God said, okay. And he caused the death of many thousand in his people. But in the classic demonstration of that, the picture of redemption comes to him. The angel hovers over the mountain peak of Jerusalem at a place called Araunah the Jebusite's threshing floor. And there the plague upon his people, the judgment of his people is stopped. It doesn't say anything else about that. But David decides that now he needs to salute God. Now he needs to hold God up, and he needs to honor God. And so he buys the field, buys that threshing floor from Araunah. Araunah is willing to give it to him, but he says, no, I'm going to pay for it. And he pays for that piece of land because now he has the notion in his mind that he's going to build God a glorious temple. Temple, by the way, that he never asked for. And he starts working on that as a plan to kind of salute God and win back his favor. And we know that from 2 Chronicles 3:1 that the temple is eventually built at that point high up on the mountain of Jerusalem. But then, now Solomon is coming to the fore, and now things get a little confused. I want to illustrate this by comparing Samuel Kings versus Chronicles. Now, you remember last week I told you that 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings were written as the nation was being threatened by its enemies. Remember? And the question that was going on in people's minds was, is God going to do anything about this? And 1st and 2nd Chronicles is the history of Israel written during the exile, much later. And the question that's going on in their minds is, does God still care? Does God still want us as his people? And so the perspective on the authorship of these things is going to be different. And like the Gospels, we're going to see how they complement each other, but also how they deliberately point us in things that the other ones don't tell us. And the question is why? That we don't really have an answer for that. But let me show you what I mean. First of all, there is the political intrigue. David is getting older. He's getting older. He's getting less capable. And now there is political intrigue. I told you about what some of his sons have done already. There's the incident that closes David's reign out in Samuel Kings with this political intrigue between one of his sons, Adonijah, and Solomon. Solomon stays out of it. Nathan and Bathsheba now kind of work on his behalf. And they try to get David to favor Solomon as opposed to Adonijah. David shows another sense of incapability to respond to this stuff. He said, I don't know how to handle my son. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. He's become very ineffective and he's become insecure in his own thinking. And so Bathsheba and Nathan are working together to kind of manipulate the future for the kingdom of Israel. In First Chronicles, the picture is very different. David is still in charge. David is still on top of things. David foresees the future coming, and he works hard to organize his kingdom, ready to pass it on. Now, David probably did this earlier, but Chronicles records it as one of the last things he did, which is just an interesting way of saying they hold up David's memory with a very positive sense. He begins the preparations of construction of the temple. He charges Solomon with the task of building it. He organizes the Levites, the priests, the musicians, the gatekeepers. There's chapter after chapter after chapter of detail about how he does this. David gives a public charge to Israel, his last speech to Israel, to the nation, and he gives a charge to Solomon and gives great offerings toward the construction project. David is in charge, and he's moving forward. Nobody's working behind the scenes. David knows what he's doing. Back in 1 Kings 1-3, David then dies, and it says that Solomon establishes his kingdom. That's the word that's used in the text, establishes. Do you know what that means? It means he murders all his enemies, including his brothers. He takes care of business. He clears the deck so that there isn't anything left for anybody left to oppose him. And that's what it means by establish his kingdom. And then we hear that's when Solomon, as king, makes his first alliance with other nations. One of the things that Solomon was very good at was, David's opposed the enemies. He's chased them off the map. Solomon now takes his power and his position, and he begins to establish trading treaties with these other nations. And that's going to help because that's where he's going to get all the materials for the temple from. And one of the greatest ways, one of the best ways to establish a treaty with another nation is through a marriage alliance. I'm going to marry your daughter. So he marries his first wife, who is a princess from Egypt, in a marriage alliance. And after that, then he comes and he has that memorable prayer before God. And God says, now that you're king, what would you have me give you? Riches, wealth, power, fame. And you remember what Solomon asked for? What does he ask for? Wisdom. Wisdom. Wisdom to do what? Wisdom to govern the people. These great people of yours, wisdom to govern the people. Wisdom means an appreciation for moral character, moral teaching, governing with a right and a wrong from God, deeply ingrained in my thought process. Could very well be that this is the period of time in his life when he started kicking out all of those Proverbs. In First Chronicles, however, things are a little bit different. David dies peacefully. Everybody mourns his loss. It is a great loss. But he leaves Solomon a kingdom that is in great shape. And so when Solomon establishes a kingdom, it doesn't record that he kills anybody off. He just takes over, and his dad's done everything for him, and it's just wonderful. And Solomon then also goes to pray that prayer for wisdom again. He prays for wisdom and knowledge to govern his people. But there again, things begin to diverge. In Kings, Solomon's wisdom is immediately demonstrated with that famous story of the prostitutes. Remember? Two prostitutes come to him and they fight over a child. And in wisdom, Solomon settles the score settles the issue without any problem. And his fame for his wisdom, his governance wisdom, just grows from that point on. His administration is large and peaceful. He's a wealthy man. He's got no threats. He sits on top of a pile of gold, all provided him by his father and everything. And he's in the best shape of any king Israel ever had. Think about that for a minute. When we get to the time of Jesus, all the people want is for the kingdom of David to be restored. Even the Psalms talk about David's son. Why not Solomon's son? Why not the kingdom of Solomon again? Oh, to have the kingdom of Solomon again. No, it doesn't. We don't read that. We read the kingdom of David. And I think part of the reason for that is because David is seen as the prototype Christ because of the moral achievements he had regarding God as his shepherd, Psalm 23, facing Goliath, going after the things like that, to fight for David. You remember his mighty men was a heroic and proud achievement to be a part of, and how glorious that was. David was just much more of a hero in the mind of the Israelites than Solomon was. Solomon was one who he just sat back and he enjoyed himself and lived the life of Riley, as they say, and didn't really accomplish anything other than the building of the temple. In Chronicles, there is no demonstration right away of his wisdom. The story of the prostitutes is left out. And instead, we hear about Solomon's administration as being rich. The nation is wealthy, not so much powerful, but wealthy. And of course, that's in anticipation of what happens next. Here's 1 Kings record. God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure and breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of the Egypt. For he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Israelite, Heman the Chalcodarda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was all in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs. His songs were 1,005, not just 1,000, but 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and birds and reptiles and of fish. He was wise about all of creation. He understood, people. He was a man of science. His wisdom was broad. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who heard of his wisdom. Then you hear about it in Chronicles. Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in chariot cities and with the king of Jerusalem. Remember, he's not at war. What does he need so many chariots and horsemen for? To show off. And the king made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore and the shephelah. And Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kua, and the king's traders would buy them from Kua for a price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. Likewise, through them, these were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. What about his wisdom? All they're doing is painting the gloriousness of the kingdom of Solomon. Because his wisdom is not for governance. His wisdom is not for the common man. His wisdom is not for science. In Chronicles, his wisdom is for one thing. In chapter 3 through 10, Solomon begins to build the temple. And in 2 Chronicles, Solomon's administration first is rich and wealthy, and then he proceeds to build the temple as well. The wisdom, in Chronicles, the wisdom that God has given him is for the building of the temple. And, of course, when you're in exile and you're writing about this, all you want to do is paint how glorious those days were, how wonderful those days were, how you couldn't believe how marvelous that temple had been, and now it's gone. And so the angle that Chronicles is giving us is completely different. Not completely different, they complement each other, but nonetheless different. Solomon proceeds to build the temple, and there's chapter after chapter after chapter of the detail of that, because everybody in exile wants to hear it again. And then Solomon's wisdom is confirmed by that famous visit of the Queen of Sheba. And that's in chapter 10 of 1 Kings. And it's recorded for us in chapter 9 of 2 Chronicles. Solomon's wisdom is confirmed. But in Chronicles, there is one small testimony. Verse 7. Your wives must be very happy. Speaking about the plurality of his wives, and of course how spoiled rotten they must be. How many wives did Solomon have?
Too many.
Anybody remember? We'll find out. Solomon now in Samuel Kings is turning from God. He is drawn away from the Lord. It even records this in chapter 11. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, first wife, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonite, Hittite. Well, he didn't care. These were all trade partners and exchange partners. He could not have enough possession of women as things, an immoral tendency of man that has never changed. Man still suffers from that desire to possess a woman as a thing. from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn you away with your heart after their gods. Even repeats the commandment. This is wrong. This is immoral, Solomon. You're doing it anyway. First Kings records this. He had 700 wives who were princesses. And you know how princesses are always easy to please and very humble and non-competitive. 300 concubines, which is just a way of using a woman without giving her anything. And his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, insisting that they have a temple too. And his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And when we talk about abomination, we're talking about immorality in worship. You know, I've told you before that all idolatry has one thing in common, and that's immorality. I don't care what any other religion or philosophy paint, immorality is at the root of every idol worship. It always leads to some way of abusing the body, either of yourself or someone else. It's just fundamental. There is that doesn't change kind of concept to the fact that we are in a moral world. Our creation is built on a moral foundation. Things don't change. On the mountain east of Jerusalem, and so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. So Solomon turns from the Lord, and as a result of that, the Lord begins to raise up adversaries against him. The judgment of God begins during the reign of Solomon, not later on in the divided monarchy, but against Solomon. But in 2 Chronicles, his reign ends in glory. They're holding up the best and wanting the reader to long for the way it used to be. And so we don't talk about Solomon's sins. We emphasize the glory that is going on. 2 Chronicles 9, thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. And all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his mind. Every one of them brought his present articles of silver and gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, and mules, so much year after year. And Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king of Jerusalem. And he ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates, to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. And horses were imported for Solomon from Egypt and from all the lands. Oh, the good old days. Which is interesting, isn't it? You know, does God still care? That's the question they're answering. Does God still care? Did he give us such glory before, and now we are slaves again? And is there anything we must do to return to the glory days of God's people? Yes, we must return to the law. We must return to the law. We must repent, and we must return to a moral understanding, embracing the 10 Commandments, practicing them with a fervor we've never had before. And then you have the rise of the Pharisees. The rise of the Pharisees who were the policemen of the 10 Commandments. We will keep you straight. We will define for you the gray areas. We will build a fence around the law so that you are careful never to violate the law again, because we want the good old days back. And so the third commandment says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. We'll prohibit everybody from saying the name of God in any time. You may never say the name of God. That's how we'll protect ourselves. We'll honor the fourth commandment by measuring how far you can go on a Sabbath. What is actual work? You can't drag a chair across the dirt floor of your house. That's plowing. You can pull your mule out of the ditch on a Sabbath, but not your son, because your son should know better. We're going to build a fence around the Ten Commandments, and we're going to practice it with a rigidity we've never known before because we want the good old days back. And that's where they're headed. That's the world that Jesus was born in. Solomon dies it's stated well in Kings, but in Chronicles, his death is in glory. Very, very different picture. And then, of course, the last pronouncement of morality follows with the beginning reign of Rehoboam, his son. And when you read the story of Rehoboam, the one question you should be answering in your own mind is, did Solomon teach his wisdom to his son?
How could he? There are too many.
No, to Rehoboam.
Oh, yeah.
He did not teach his own son what God had pleasured to give him. Rehoboam acts as a fool right off the bat. And it divides the kingdom. And from then on, we're off to the races. The divided kingdom goes on and on and on. Rehoboam does not demonstrate instruction and wisdom. He in no way does he appreciate and practice the things of his father. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. I'm going to treat you worse than he ever thought. That's his thought of wisdom. That's what he thought he should do. He didn't listen to the older advisors. He listened to the younger punks. And he was a fool from the very beginning because his father never taught him what God gave to him.
Or if his father taught him.
What?
Or if his father did teach him, his son looked at his father's life.
Yeah. Well, Bob, that we could assume that might be the case, that Rehoboam just didn't listen. But we know so many other things about Solomon's life, including his wives, that it seems pretty clear that he didn't attend to his sons much at all. And if he did, that I think because the record is a moral one, that would have been there. I would think that would have been there. The absence is not just forget the historians forgetting it. I think the absence is telling the story that the author wants to portray. There is no moral teaching here. But that's, argument from silence. Any questions? Any comments? Oh, we're out of time. If you can, dig into the book of Proverbs. Let's read the first 9 chapters for next week, and we'll talk about covenantal instruction, covenantal education.